Hi, I'm Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and in this video lesson, we're going to learn how to manage local storage on PCs running Windows 8. This is for the Microsoft Certification Exam 70-687, which covers configuring Windows 8. This particular objective has three sub-objectives. Manage disk volumes. Volumes are a logical layer on top of the physical hard disks that you put into computers. And any one physical disk usually just has one volume, but sometimes you can have multiple volumes on a disk. So we're going to learn how to manage those. It's pretty easy. Up next, we'll learn how to manage file system fragmentation. And this doesn't at all belong on this exam. In fact, a Windows operating system hasn't required you to do anything with this file system fragmentation since I think Windows XP. It's been automated since Windows Vista on, and you don't have to worry about it. You don't ever have to do anything, not in enterprise environments, not in your own personal computer, and not in small businesses. I will show you what file system fragmentation is, though, and show you the one tool that you can use to manage it, but it's really in the real world, you don't ever need to touch it. And the last sub-objective is to manage storage spaces. Storage spaces are a feature that's new to Windows 8, and it's one of my favorite features of Windows 8. It's really cool because you can take all your old hard drives of varying sizes and plug them into your PC and get some actual use out of them. It will combine them logically into one volume that you can just save files on and not worry about which of many different physical disks it's going to. It even provides for redundancy in case one of your drives fails, you won't lose your data. And now for a real-world scenario. Good old Mary has filled up her hard disk, and now she can't save any new files, and she's getting all these errors about being out of disk space. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a hard disk to her computer, and then we're going to configure it with a new volume and a drive letter, and we'll format it so that she can save all her new files to that disk. So let's take a look at Mary's computer. So here we are on Mary's PC, and the first thing I'll do is I'll open up the disk management tool to take a look at the existing configuration. I'm going to hold down the Windows key and press X. That opens up the WinX menu, and then I'll open up the computer management console. You can see there's a separate disk management console there, but I find it easier just to use computer management for everything because you can see it's got all these different tools built into it. So you can see right now she has two different volumes, but one physical hard disk as well as a CD-ROM. So you can see she has the one physical hard disk here, size of 122 gigabytes, and it's got two separate volumes on it. Now, you can have many different volumes on a physical hard disk. A volume is basically the same thing as a partition. It's just the way that Microsoft refers to it. Windows 8 PCs by default will have a reserved partition. This system reserved partition has the recovery tools on it, and as well as some files used to start Windows up. And then your C drive has all your system files and all your documents and everything else, and additionally that's where you're going to save everything by default. So Mary has one disk, two volumes, but not enough free space. So I'm going to shut her PC down so we can add a new disk. Now, in showbiz, they have a term called breaking down the fourth wall. And that fourth wall is the wall of the TV itself. If somebody's watching a TV show, they imagine themselves peering in. But every now and then, somebody will take a look at the camera and talk about the TV show. Breaking down the fourth wall is what I'm going to do right now. I am showing you Oracle VirtualBox Manager. And this here is Mary's PC. So to add a disk to it, I'm just going to go in and select the settings for her PC and then select the storage option here. Because it's a virtual machine, it's really easy for me to add virtual drives. Now, of course, on Mary's physical computer in the real world, you'd have to grab a disk and physically connect it probably to an SATA connection. I'm just showing you the process of doing this in VirtualBox because I think virtual machines are really, really useful. And you're probably going to want to spend some time playing with different storage options. And if you install VirtualBox, it's free. You can do all of this and create computers with 10 different drives in it. And it's exactly like you had this wide array of physical hardware at your disposal. So I've clicked the button to create a new disk on her existing SATA controller, and I'll choose to create a new disk. And I'm just going to select the default options. I won't go through these in detail because, of course, it's not directly relevant to your exam. So I'm just naming her new disk Mary's new disk. And this, again, this is occurring outside of Windows 8. This is in my virtual environment. So on her virtual machine, you can see she has an SATA controller. That was her existing system disk, and now she has a second disk. So I'll put that fourth wall back up and start her PC. So logging back into her PC, I will once again open up the computer management tool from the WinX menu. And now I'll select the disk management console here. And it pops right up. It tells me we detected a new disk and you must initialize it first. So you can see this happens automatically. Now it's asking me to select a partition style. The two options you have here are good old master boot record and the much newer GPT GUID partition table. All recent versions of Windows will work with either one. GPT is a requirement for some newer PCs, specifically those that use the UEFI style firmware. If MBR is an option to you, I would go ahead and select that because it provides greater compatibility. That's not usually an issue, and you can probably select GPT and it will never be a problem. I will say the one time you'll be glad you have MBR is when something goes wrong and you need to boot off of some offline recovery tools like a Linux-based recovery tool, a live CD, for example. Some of them don't recognize the new GUID partition table style drives, so I like to select MBR just because it provides better backwards compatibility and I don't need any of the features of a GPT. And as an IT guy, that's generally a good rule. Go with the older technology unless you specifically need the newer technology. So I selected that and you can see the disk is now considered online and it has 125 gigabyte unallocated space. I'll open up Explorer here, and if you look at your computer, you can see it still only shows one drive, the C drive. When you add a drive, even after you initialize it, it's not yet available in Explorer and nobody can save files to it because it doesn't yet have an active volume. So now that it exists and is initialized, I'll select it here, right-click it, and then click New Simple Volume. The New Simple Volume wizard appears, and I'll skip the introduction page here. Now it's going to ask me for the size of the volume. By default, it's going to use the entire disk. And, you know, back in the olden days, we used to create multiple partitions on each disk. It would just allow you to store your documents on one partition and your system files on a different partition. We kind of used it to organize our files and to limit the risk of running out of disk space on the system drive. Nowadays, we're kind of throwing that philosophy out. I say create one big volume on every drive you get and just make the most of it. So I'll go ahead and leave the default setting, which uses the entire disk for a single volume. And you can see here it's asking me to assign a drive letter or path. Now, Mary just wants us to have a new drive letter, so we can leave the default of E here. You also have the option to mount the new drive as a folder. So you could make a subfolder of her documents folder that is just big files and tell her to save all her big files there and it would go onto this other drive. That's kind of tricky. I feel like this is more useful in server scenarios on the desktop where users are a little more aware of how much space they have on each drive. I think people already know about drive letters and that space is limited on a per drive basis, so it makes it much easier if you just select a drive letter. So I'll leave that for Mary. And now it's asking me to format the volume. You can choose not to format the volume, but then you wouldn't be able to save any files to it. So by default, these settings are just great. I would just change the volume label. The volume label isn't much use in Explorer since you're going to identify the drive by drive letters, but you know where I find it useful is when things go wrong. When I need to open up some recovery tools and I can't start Windows, well, I won't know those drive letters because those are a construct of Windows. If you boot from a Linux Live CD, what you will see though is the volume label. Same thing will be visible if you use the Windows recovery tools and use, for example, the diskpart command line tool. If you're trying to find the drive that has all your files on it, you're going to be looking at the volume label. And it's really frustrating if you have a bunch of drives and the volume label says new volume on all of them. That's the default. And I've definitely logged into diskpart before and seen a bunch of different volumes with exactly the same label, and it makes life really hard. So give it a unique label, something that you'll be able to identify later when you need to find that drive. The Perform a Quick Format option is selected by default, and it does what it says. You can format a drive by either just setting up kind of the table of contents for the drive and then leaving the rest of it as is. It probably has random junk on it. Or you can disable quick format and it will do a full format. And when it does a full format, it literally goes in and writes zeros over every bit of data on the drive. If you previously had some confidential data on that drive and you want to make sure nobody finds it, you should turn off that quick format option. If it's a brand new drive, you might as well just leave quick format enabled. It'll save you a lot of time. And this last checkbox down here, enable file and folder compression. That's a good thing to do. It's exactly like you went into Explorer later and turned on folder compression, but it just saves a little bit of space. Usually it's like 30% of the drive space. If you're storing MP3s and videos, it won't make any difference, but Mary, she's going to be saving Word files and such, so we might as well turn that on, and maybe she won't fill up this new drive as fast as she did the previous one. And the final page here just summarizes your choices, so I'll click Finish. And now you can see it begins to format it, and the formatting is instantly done because it's a quick format, and suddenly Windows discovers, hey, I have a new drive here, and it notifies you and asks you what should happen with that drive, but it's not actually a removable drive, it's misdetecting it. So now that we have that formatted, we should be able to go into Explorer here, and sure enough, we can see her E drive here. Just to make life a little bit easier on Mary, I'll create a folder for her. And I will add that to the Documents library. So we covered this in detail in another lesson, but when you do add a drive and you hope for users to save files to it, it's a good idea to add it to their existing library so that they can easily find the folder. Now, instead of having to save everything to the E drive, she'll just be able to look in Documents and then dig into the Documents E drive here. Here's another real-world scenario that happens for me quite regularly, and it's needing to shrink an existing partition. Partitions, again, they're basically the same thing as a volume. Now, when you install Windows by default, it creates partitions that take up your entire hard drive, and that's usually okay. There are times when you want to have multiple partitions on a drive, though, and for us IT nerds, one of the most common is needing to install multiple operating systems on a single drive. For example, if you wanted to install Windows 9, whenever that happens to come out, you might want to install it on a separate partition because that's the only way to allow two versions of Windows to exist on a single drive. If your existing partition consumed the entire drive, well, you'd have to shrink that partition to make it small enough that you could create a new partition. So in this real-world scenario, we're going to go into our computer and shrink the system drive down as much as possible and then create a new partition in the free space. Here's our Windows 8 PC, and you can see I have disk management already open. To shrink a partition, it's as easy as selecting it, right-clicking it, and then selecting Shrink Volume. Now, it's going to determine how much we can shrink it by. And as you can see here, it's a 25 gig volume and it's letting me shrink it by 4.6 gigabytes. Now let's flip over to Explorer and see just how much free space is on that disk. So that's interesting because the disk actually has about 9 gigs of free space, but it's only letting me shrink it by 4.6. You'd think, in theory, you'd be able to shrink the disk by however much free space is available. That's not quite the case. The disk is a little bit fragmented, which means it has files spread all over the disk. and in order to shrink it, it needs to have a contiguous section of the disk available. So in other words, when you're saving files to the disk, it might throw them anywhere on the disk. When you go to shrink a volume, it needs to find one section that doesn't have any of your files in it. And in this case, the largest contiguous section is about 4.5 gigs. That's why I can't use the entire 9 gigs of free space. Now, I'll give you a really important tip here. Windows isn't that great at shrinking partitions because it just, you think it could give me the whole 9 gigs of free space, right? Like go into the disk and move some stuff around, and then when you have the entire 9 gigs free, shrink that. Well, Windows can't do that. Windows doesn't move stuff around. It just looks for the biggest contiguous section. However, you can use a Linux Live CD, such as Hiram's Rescue CD, and it will have tools in it that will allow you to shrink the partition down to the full available free space. These tools just have the intelligence to go in and move existing stuff around. That's a feature Windows lacks. But I will work with the tools that we have here and imagine that 4.5 or 4.6 gigs is going to be enough. So I'll click the shrink button here. Now you can see that happened pretty quickly. Now we have a smaller C drive and we have about 4.5 gigs here unallocated. The last step before I can install something on this is to make a partition out of it. So I will just create a new simple volume and accept the default setting, which is to use up all remaining disk space. And we'll assign it a new drive letter. It picks the next available drive letter by default. So I'll select F and I'll format it as Linux. That way I'll be able to find the volume later. You know, while I'm here, I'll discuss the file system options a little bit. You have two options, FAT32 and NTFS. NTFS is the right choice basically all the time now. FAT32 is a very old file system, and it, I think, has a maximum size of 2 terabytes. Anyway, it doesn't support large disks like NTFS does. It also doesn't support compression or file security and lots of integrity checking that occurs with NTFS. So if you use FAT32, you'll be able to work with older operating systems, but you lose lots of security and reliability and features such as encryption and compression. So I recommend always using NTFS unless you have that backwards compatibility need. So I'll finish that up. You can see it's instantly formatted and it's already available to Windows as the F drive. So whenever I want to install the new operating system, I'd see that partition available for an install. Now we're going to flip that scenario around and we're going to cover how to extend a partition. In this scenario, Mary filled up her disk drive, but rather than giving her an extra hard disk, we're going to replace her existing hard disk with a much bigger drive. Now I won't walk you through this step by step because the exam won't have this, but it's a common scenario in the real world. Now, if a user with a desktop runs out of disk space, usually what you'll do is you will just add a new drive in and then configure them to save their files on that new drive, and you don't have to touch the system drive at all. If it's a laptop computer or one of these micro PCs that only has room for a single drive, you need to take out the existing drive and replace it with a bigger drive if you want them to have more disk space. Now, of course, the new drive doesn't have Windows installed on it, and it won't have all their system files, but what you can find are disk cloning tools. You can use these disk cloning tools to copy the existing drive over to a new drive. Another way to do it is to perform a full system image backup and then restore that system image to the new PC. We will cover performing system image backups and recovering them in a different lesson. Whether you copy the contents of the old drive to the new drive using cloning or using a system image backup, when it's done, you'll have the same amount of free disk space that you had before. In other words, if you take a 500 gigabyte drive and you copy it to a 2 terabyte drive, when you start up Windows, you're still going to be looking at a 500 gigabyte drive. And the reason is that these tools don't change your partition size. They copy over the existing partition bit by bit, and any free space will be unallocated. What you need to do after you start up Windows is to extend the existing partition to take up the rest of the free space. So in this scenario, we've just replaced Mary's hard drive, and we need to extend her partition so that she can actually take advantage of the extra space. So this might look familiar, but it should work for the purposes of the example. You can see Mary's C drive is here, and sure enough, the hard disk has some extra space. All we need to do is to right-click her existing C drive and then select Extend Volume. Now I'll follow this wizard, and it will prompt me to select the disk that I want to extend. You can see it automatically selects whatever it is that I right-clicked, so that's not a problem. Now it prompts me to choose how much I want to extend it by, and by default it's going to extend it for the full amount of any unallocated space. So you can see that's about 4.6 gigs. And on the final page here, I just confirm it. And voila, she has a bigger drive and she's now using all of the capacity on the physical hard drive. Now, so far I've been showing you how to use the disk management console, and that works great. It has one big problem with it though. It only works when Windows works. And since you're talking about editing disks here, it's entirely possible that you need to configure your disks before Windows works. Or it's possible that you made a disk configuration change that stopped Windows from booting properly. Either way, there are times when you need to be able to edit your disk partitions, but you can't start Windows. When you do that, you have two separate options. You can boot up the Windows recovery tools and work from a command line, or you can boot up a Linux Live CD. Now, the Linux Live CD definitely won't be covered on the exam, so I'll cover that second. Let's start with the Windows recovery tools. Jump over to Windows 8 here. So here we are on our Windows 8 PC. And to get to the recovery tools when Windows will start, what you'll do is search the settings for Startup and then select Advanced Startup Options. I'll scroll down here and then under Advanced Startup, I'll click Restart Now. This just opens up the menu that appears automatically anytime something goes wrong with Windows that doesn't allow Windows to start normally. So in other words, if you manage to mess up Windows so bad that it won't start, this menu will appear automatically. But if you just want to go in and play with it, you need to go into Windows and run the Advanced Startup options. So from here, I'll select the Troubleshoot option. And you can see you have options for refreshing or resetting your PC, which are the kinds of things you want to do when Windows won't start. They're covered in other lessons. For now, I'll go under Advanced Options. And we'll cover all these options in other lessons, but in order to get to the disk partitioning tools, you need to go into the command prompt. I will point out that the automatic repair option here, pretty useful. If you're messing with the partitions and Windows won't start, I always give automatic repair a shot, and it fixes the problem about half the time. And about the other half of the time, you're gonna have to do it yourself, which means the command prompt here. So this is just restarting the PC one more time before opening up the command prompt. Now this will start up even if you can't load Windows. Even if you can't find Windows, you can put in your Windows DVD or a flash drive containing Windows and start from that. And then when Windows setup starts, you'll see a little option for repairing Windows. Just select that. Now if you have an existing Windows installation and Windows can read it, then it's going to prompt you for a username and password. This is a really half-hearted security effort because this gives us access to everything on the drive. Now, you could do this with a non-Windows tool and it wouldn't prompt you for the username and password and you get the same level of access, but they require you to put in a username and password when using the recovery tools built within Windows. So this is all we have now. This is just a command prompt, and it's a good reason to get a little practice in at a command prompt so that if you ever do have to use these tools, you're familiar with it. I know we're all kind of spoiled by using a mouse and keyboard and graphical user interfaces nowadays, but the good old command prompt, which is the standard back when I was growing up, still comes in handy when Windows won't start. So a couple quick file management tools. dir just shows you a directory. That was the Windows system drive. CD changes directories, it stands for change directory, and you can put in a backslash to jump to the root of your current drive. So I'll switch to the root here and then type dir again. And you can see here the folders within the normal drive. I'll switch into the users directory and you can see that my user folders are not here. That's because this is the special recovery partition. It is not the usual C drive. If you need to do any partition editing from this, you can use the diskpart tool. So I'll run the diskpart command now. And diskpart is a pretty confusing tool to use. I hate DiskPart so much that I tell everybody to burn a Linux CD or a bootable Linux flash drive and use Linux-based recovery tools. Because these Linux tools are free and they provide a graphical user interface and you don't have to remember any commands. And I can never remember the DiskPart commands. You don't have to either. Just remember you can put in a question mark. So run DiskPart. Remember it's like a disk partition. Commands back in the DOS days before Windows, they were all limited to 8 characters. So that's why it's called DiskPart and not some more meaningful name like disk partitioning tool. So entering a question mark and pressing enter into the DiskPart tool lists all the available commands. And you can see here, the first thing you'd probably want to do is to list any partitions that were available. So you can see down here, there's the option for list. Now, if I type list, it's still not a full command. It wants me to select whether I want to list the disks or the partitions or the volumes. So for now, let's start by listing the disks. I'll do that again. I'll show you a keyboard shortcut. You can see I typed list disks instead of list disk, and it blew its mind. It has no idea what I'm talking about. What do you mean list disks? It was a typo, but to quickly retype your previous command, just hit the up arrow key. You can also hit up arrow multiple times to switch between the last several things you typed. So I'll hit up arrow and then I'll fix my typo and press enter again. And you can see that this particular computer has 2 physical hard drives attached. This has nothing to do with the partitions. When you do list disk, it lists the actual physical drives. One drive is 25 gigabytes and the other drive is 125 gigabytes. This number here is not the free disk space on the partitions. Again, this can't see partitions. This is the unpartitioned space on the disk, which is why it's basically 1 megabyte. Now, I will try to list the partitions, but it's not going to work for me. So I'll run the list partition command, and you can see it tells me that you have to select a disk. So this is part of why I hate the DiskPart tool. Now that I've listed the disks, I need to select one of the disks before I can view the partitions on the disk. It's just really cumbersome. So I can't tell much from this. I see disk 0 and disk 1. I'm probably going to want to identify which one is the system partition so I can fix it, basically. So I'll start by selecting disk 0. And you can see disk 0 is now the selected disk. Now I can list the actual partitions on it. So I'll run the list partition command again, and you can see that it has 2 separate partitions. It has that recovery partition, the 350 megabyte partition. We saw that in the computer management console earlier. And then it has the primary partition, which is 24 gigabytes. Now I'll select the other disk and list the partitions again. And you can see that second disk only has a single partition on it. And you can see that it also gives you the option to list volumes. So I'll do that real quick just so you can see the difference. This can make life a little bit easier. You can see here that it listed all the volumes on any of the disks, along with the drive letter that I'm most familiar with. It even listed the CD-ROM here. It doesn't, of course, tell you what disk or partition anything is, but you can see that everything is accessible. Now let's view the list of commands again. There are a couple of things that you tend to do besides just exploring the different partitions and volumes using this command line tool. Usually, since you're not running Windows right now, the first thing you want to do is get Windows up and running, right? Now, Windows always has a single active partition, and that's the boot partition. Often when Windows won't start, it's because the right partition isn't marked as active. So sometimes when you just clone a drive, the software will copy over all the files, but it doesn't properly mark it as active, and you need to go in and do that. So let's back up a little bit and we'll list the drives again. That was not correct. List disk. And we know the system drive should be on disk 0, so I'll select disk 0. And let's list the partitions. The first thing I'll do is I'll select partition 2, and then I'm going to show you the detail command. Detail partition. Now you can see here that it's telling me it's a 24 gigabyte healthy partition, and it doesn't show anything under the info here. That means it's not a system drive. So I will select partition 1, and then detail that partition. And you can see here, actually, it shows it over here. It says active yes, and you can see for partition 2 it said active no. So the fact that it's active means that when my computer boots up, it's going to look at this partition for the system files. So what I'll do now is I will intentionally mark the wrong partition active. So I'm going to switch back to partition 2. And now I'm going to run the active command, which marks the partition as active. Now we'll detail the existing partition, and you can see that partition 2 is active. If I go back and select partition 1 again, you can see it's not active. Now, just to test things out, I'm going to give this PC a reboot, and we can see how Windows handles having the wrong partition marked active. You can close the disk part tool and go back to the regular command line by typing the exit command. So here the PC is trying to boot, and you can see Windows isn't terribly helpful. For some reason, it is completely unable to find the partition. What you get is this error message saying that Windows failed to start. And it does give you some pretty helpful tips here. It says you can insert your Windows installation disk, and when prompted, click repair your computer, and that probably will fix it. We're going to fix it in a different way though. I am going to go in and use a Linux live CD and show you how a little more sophisticated partition editing can be even when you can't run Windows. So I'll insert that CD now. So I've inserted the CD, and you can see it's now starting up. I am going to, this particular CD is called Hiren's Boot CD. You can see it described up here. And it includes a lot of different tools on it. The tool that I find most useful is the Linux-based rescue environment here. So I'll start that up, and I'll use the default options. It's going to take a second. And these are all free open source tools. It's pretty amazing what you can do with free software nowadays, but I'll run the partition editor from here. And look, you can select from the different drives, and here you can see the label that we put on there. That's what I was talking about, making it easier to find it. Now this is our 25 gig drive, so we can recognize that as the system drive. And in fact, you can see that this partition here is labeled system reserved. That's a good clue that that is indeed the system drive that should be booting. Now this second partition here is the 25 gig partition that I just marked active, and I shouldn't have done that, and Windows couldn't fix it. You can tell it's the active partition because it has the boot flag here. The boot partition and the active partition are exactly the same thing. They're just different ways of saying it. I think boot partition is a lot clearer, but for some reason the disk part tool calls it an active partition. Just remember that. So what I need to do is to make this the active or boot partition. So I'll just right click it. And this isn't going to be on the exam. This is just for your own personal reference. These Linux tools are great, and when your computer can't start, this is going to make your life a lot easier. So I'm going to right click it and then click Manage Flags here, and I will select it as the boot partition and then click Close. And now we can see that this smaller partition here is the boot partition, and this partition is not. Only one partition at a time can be a boot partition. So this should fix our problems. Let's give this computer a reboot and see if it does indeed allow us to start Windows. There we go. I broke Windows using the disk parted tool and then fixed it with a Linux tool. I could have done it. I could have fixed it with the disk parted tool too. You don't need to use third-party tools. I just wanted to show you that it's really much easier when you can go in with a graphical tool. Now let's talk about fragmentation. And this is one of those things that's easier to show you than tell you. So I'll log into Windows 8 and then install a free fragmentation tool so we can visualize what's going on. So the tool I'm going to show you is called Defraggler. And it's just a free tool that shows you the fragmentation on your drive. All right, so we'll download and install this. Fragmentation is really an outdated concept, and as I was saying earlier, I don't think it at all belongs in this objective. You don't need to know anything about fragmentation. You never will. Fragmentation, however, is something that had a drastic impact on the performance of older versions of Windows. This is just the defraggler setup, so I'll just accept the default settings and get it running. Oh, don't want that default setting. Always watch out for that. They always try to trick you into installing some toolbar. So this tool allows me to visualize the fragmentation on the drive. You can see that these little blocks make up all the little blocks of data on the drive. The empty spots don't have any data, and the grayed in spots do have some data on them. Now, when you think of how full your drive is, you probably visualize it like this pie chart. Like this is the full stuff, and this is the empty part. That's not really how it's physically laid out, though. This is a better representation of how data is physically written to the drive. You can see Windows starts by saving all the data to the outside. If this is the physical circular magnetic drive here, it starts by saving it all to the outside. The reason it's saving it to the outside of the drive is that the outside is fastest. That's pretty amazing, right? The outside of a physical magnetic spinning drive is fastest because the drive, of course, spins, and the outside is where the circumference is the greatest. So the drive is being spun at a constant rate, but the outside part is spinning faster than the inside part. Think of a bicycle tire. Clearly, the tire itself is spinning faster than the spokes on the inside. Anyway, Windows writes to the outside of the physical drive first, and then as it gets filled in, it starts to move closer and closer into the center, and generally it kind of spirals in until it fills up the drive and writes to the center part of the drive very last. But it doesn't work exactly like that. Sometimes you save a file and then delete it, and that will leave you with this big empty spot here, and this is considered fragmentation. Now, any one file might consume a contiguous part of the disk, or it might consume a discontiguous part of the disk. Now here we can see some discontiguous files. What I did was I opened up File List here and then allowed it to analyze the disk. And this one particular log file here, you can see because it's a log file, Windows writes a little bit to it, and then the next day it writes a little more to it. Well, the first time Windows went to write this cbs.log file, this particular spot was available. And because it's closest to the outside of the drive, the fastest part, it wrote it here. The next time Windows went to write to the same log file, this part of the disk had all been filled up. So it just continued writing this same file at the next available part of the disk. So these orange spots here are all the same file, but you can see it's broken up across different parts of the disk. This is called fragmentation. The file itself is fragmented. Here's why fragmentation can be a bad thing. With a physical hard disk, the disk spins at a constant rate. And the disk will read fastest when it reads from this block here to this block here to this block here, exactly like playing an old-time record. Things get much, much slower when the disk has to read here and then jump here and here. Magnetic disks have a needle, just like the needle on a record player, and if it needs to read from different parts of the disk, it has to do what's called a seek, a random seek. So it has to jump to another part of the disk, and that takes a moment. It takes just a few milliseconds, but when you're jumping a lot like this, those milliseconds add up, and what the result is much slower disk access time. And when disk access time is slow, everything on your computer is slow. Trust me on this one. So if we were to read this cbs.log file, it would read this little byte in here, and then it would jump to a different part of the disk, which would take a little bit, and it would read these 2 bytes. And then we'd have to wait again while it jumped to this part and read those 3 blocks, and then we wait again, and it would read a few more, and then we wait again. that would all be pretty slow. What we want instead is for this particular file to be defragmented, for it to occupy a contiguous part of the disk. So what I did was I selected it and then just selected the defrag highlighted button here. Now this is a third-party tool, Defraggler, and you're never going to need to do this for the exam. But I simply wanted to show this tool to you so you'd understand what fragmentation was. Now, I defragmented it and it disappeared because it now occupied a single block on the disk and it was no longer fragmented. Now, I don't want you defragmenting individual files. This will make you neurotic. If you go in there with the Fraggler and you're like, layout.ini, that's fragmented. That means things are taking longer than it needs to. I better defragment this. Well, it's in 18 fragments, and a typical seek time for each one of these jumps is about 9 milliseconds. So, you know, we're talking, if you need to read the whole file, it's going to have to seek 17 times. So that's 17 jumps at 9 milliseconds a piece. Well, that's a really small number. That's like 1% of 1 second that you'd end up waiting. And if you think about it, the time that it takes you to go in and defragment that file, I'm pretty sure it's less than 1/100th of a second. So don't bother defragmenting things. It's certainly not like this. Now, Windows does not have a graphical defragmentation tool in it anymore. Earlier versions of Windows did, and Microsoft took it out because you don't need to use it, and people were getting distracted. People were getting obsessive. They're like, oh, my file is fragmented. I better just go in and defragment everything. People were spending their time trying to optimize the performance of the drive by nitpicking the fragmentation, and it was a waste of their time. So Microsoft literally just deleted the tool. I've never seen them do anything like that before. They're just like, people are obsessed with fragmentation and it's a waste of time. What they did is they completely automated the process of defragmentation by implementing a scheduled task. So let's take a look at that scheduled task now. I'll jump to the start menu and search it for scheduled task, and I'll switch over to the settings here and we'll launch the schedule task tool. We can find the fragmentation schedule task under Microsoft, Windows, and then defrag. And you'll see there's one task here. So Windows will run this whenever it decides it's necessary. It only runs it on computers with magnetic hard drives. If you have one of these fancy new SSD drives, the solid state drives, which pretty much all high-end laptops and a lot of new high-end desktops have, they never need to be defragmented because defragmentation doesn't make a difference. When I was back here with the defragmentation tool and describing the delay in seeking from one part of a file to the next, that only applies to magnetic spinning drives. Solid-state drives can access any part of the drive with absolutely no delay whatsoever. Therefore, files on SSD drives can be fragmented all you want and it will never impact performance. Therefore, SSD drives don't get defragmented. In fact, defragmentation is bad for SSD drives because SSD drives only support a limited number of reads and writes. That's a high number. It's probably not ever going to be an issue for you, but there's no need to be reading and writing to a drive if there's no performance benefit, right? So for that reason, Windows automatically defragments magnetic drives, but it does not automatically defragment SSD drives. If you decide you want to defragment a drive and you don't want to use a third-party tool, you can run the defrag command line tool. So I opened up the WinX menu and I'll select command prompt here, and we can just take a look at the defragment options. /? Is a good way to figure out how a command works if you ever forget. And who can remember all these command line options? So if you want to manually defragment a drive, all you really need to do is to run defrag and then the letter of the drive with a colon. So that would defragment the drive. I ran this command prompt without administrative privileges. So I'll just open up a command prompt with admin privileges and we'll run defrag C: again. And you can see it's now starting to defragment the C drive. Again, you don't ever need to do that. I just wanted to show you the tool. So now we're ready for another real world scenario, and this is to use storage spaces. Storage spaces is one of the coolest new features in Windows 8, and if you're like me, you have this stack of old hard drives left over from previous upgrades and old computers that you don't use anymore. Well, you can finally get some use out of these old hard drives. One of the challenges with using assorted hard drives like that is you might have a 200 gigabyte hard drive and then a 1 terabyte drive, and you have this assortment of different drives, but you don't want to have to worry about where you keep all your different files. When you have so many different drives, it can be really hard to remember what you use for what. And then if you have a 500 gigabyte drive, well, that fills up pretty fast nowadays, and so you're dealing with running out of disk space way more often than if you just had a single logical volume. Storage spaces allows you to take all these physical drives and make one logical volume. So you can access it like you had one drive that was the cumulative space of all the different drives. One of the side effects of using a bunch of different drives, of course, is that you increase your failure rate by a great deal. If you have 10 drives in there, well, the odds are much higher that any one of those 10 drives would fail than if you just had a single drive. Now, it's not quite 10 times as likely that something is going to fail on any given day, because drives have an expected lifespan. So if your 10 drives have a lifespan of about 5 years, in the first 2 years, most likely none of them are going to fail. But as you get into years 3, 4, 5, 6, the odds of one of those 10 drives failing gets to be much higher than if you just had a single drive. So when you use multiple drives like that, any sort of redundancy gets to be really important. Now, the term redundancy, of course, it means a duplication of data. And it's commonly used with drives to indicate that you have some sort of mirroring or parity or RAID going on. Redundancy protects the loss of any individual drive. So imagine I had an array of 10 drives and one of those drives failed. Redundancy would protect my data so that I could keep accessing my data. Basically, redundancy just stores an extra copy of your data, spreads it across all the different disks in an array. Storage spaces can do this too, which makes it all that much more useful for taking all those old drives and combining them into one useful space. If one of my old drives finally gives up the ghost and dies on me, well, I can keep accessing my data. So let's dig in there and use an assortment of old drives as a single logical volume. Here's my Windows 8 computer, and I will open up the Computer Management Console from the WinX menu and go into disk management here. Now you can see it's asking me to initialize disks. That's because it has 4 brand new disks in the computer, as well as 1 disk from earlier. I won't initialize them now. I just wanted to show you that the drives do exist and are available. You can see they're all different sizes too. So to launch storage spaces, I'll go back to the Start menu and search for storage. You need to look in the settings here and launch the Storage Spaces control panel tool. From here, I'll just click Create a New Pool and Storage Space. A pool is basically a grouping of drives, and then the storage space is the logical volume-like thing on top of it. By default, when you choose to create a storage pool, it will add all unused drives into the storage pool. So here you can see the 5 unused drives attached to this computer, and their varying sizes. We have sizes all the way from 25 gigabytes to 700 gigabytes. This just illustrates that you don't need to have identical drives or even drives of similar capacity. Previous versions of Windows, you were allowed to combine drives into mirroring or striping, but they had to be exactly the same size, or at least the partitions had to be the same size. That could lead to wasted space. Here, we can combine different sizes of drives. So I'll create this pool. And now it's going to ask me for a name. I'll leave that. And then it's going to ask me for a resiliency type. The resiliency is just their term for redundancy. It's actually a better term than redundancy, because redundancy sounds bad, but resiliency sounds good, right? They're the same thing though. So you have some different options here. Simple, no resiliency, uses your existing capacity in the most efficient way possible by not storing any duplicate data. So if the combined total of my 5 drives is 1.5 terabytes, which it is, selecting simple will allow me to use that entire 1.5 terabytes because it doesn't store duplicate copies of any of the data. If I select a two-way mirror, it stores every bit of data that I write on the drive in two different places. So my maximum capacity is going to be, at best, half of the total capacity. After all, if I store a 10 megabyte file, it's going to store 2 copies of that 10 megabyte file on different physical drives. Therefore, every file is actually consuming twice as much disk space. The next option here, a three-way mirror, really provides you a lot of redundancy. With a two-way mirror, you can lose any one of the drives in your pool and not lose a bit of data. If you choose a three-way mirror, you can actually lose 2 drives out of your pool and continue accessing your data. So if you really can't afford to lose your data, for example, if you don't have a backup, well, you might be better off selecting a three-way mirror. If you have a three-way mirror and you lose one of your drives, it then becomes a two-way mirror. So you need to replace one of those drives if you want to restore your resiliency. The last resiliency option here is for parity. Parity uses the space most efficiently. So when we had a two-way mirror here, you see I had a maximum size of about 776 gigabytes. A three-way mirror gave me 517 gigabytes. Parity gives me a full terabyte. Parity provides the same level of resiliency as the two-way mirror. I can lose one of my drives and keep on trucking because there's an extra copy of every bit of data there. But instead of just storing each bit of data in 2 different places, Parity uses mathematical algorithms to allow your PC to restore missing information if you pull one of the drives out, and it doesn't do it by just keeping an extra copy of it. So you can see out of my 1.5 terabytes, I will have 1 terabyte left, which means 1 terabyte for data, and the remaining 0.5 terabytes is used for that parity recovery information. The interesting thing here is I could lose any one of the 5 drives in my pool and still continue accessing my data because of the parity. So because of the complex mathematical calculations required for parity, it's a little bit slower than the other types of resiliency. Of course, when you're talking about performance, no resiliency is the fastest. Every time you write data, it only has to write it to one place. With a two-way mirror, every time you write a byte of data to the drive, it needs to write that data twice. So suddenly your write speeds are half the speed that they were before. Resiliency doesn't affect your read speeds until you lose a drive, but your write speeds are always slowed down. And with a three-way mirror, it needs to write the data to 3 different places, which can substantially slow down your writes, not good for performance. The parity writes the data to basically 2 different places. First, it writes your original copy of data, but then it needs to perform some parity calculations, and it stores that parity on a different drive. So any form of resiliency results in slower performance, but it's all much better performance if you lose one of your drives, because simple means you won't be able to access your data at all. You'll be glad you had some parity. So I will select parity resiliency to use my disk space in the most efficient way possible, even though I know it's going to require some extra calculations by my processor. Now I'll just create that storage space. Well, I'm excited to be able to get some use out of all those old drives. And you can see right away we didn't have to format the drive. Storage spaces took care of that for us. So I'm just going to click this notification up here, and we'll use Explorer to view our new drive. You can see it appears right there in Explorer. I've got 1 full terabyte free, and I don't know that it's 5 different drives. It just works. I also can't see the resiliency, but if one of those drives fails, well, I'll still be able to access my files. So I'll tell you what, I will create a folder, and then I'll just save a file inside of it so we can look at it later. Here's another scenario, and this one's a little scary. In this one, we lose one of the physical drives from our storage space. This happens. Drives die all the time, and you know what? If you don't have a backup, you better hope you have some resiliency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to yank one of the drives out of that computer and then start it up again, and we'll see what we can do to recover from it. So here I am in Windows 8. I will open up the computer management console so we can take a look at the disk management tool. And you can see here, even though we took 5 physical drives and combined them into a single storage space, the disk management tool doesn't know this. Storage Spaces hides that architecture. So even the disk management tool thinks it's one physical drive. So if we want to see the individual physical drives, we'll need to use the storage space tool to see that one of them failed. So go back into the Start menu and search for Storage Spaces in Settings. And this is what we see now. Storage Spaces is giving me a warning saying reduced resiliency. Check the physical drive section, and this is the physical drive section right here. You can see that of my 5 drives, 4 are marked OK. One drive, however, has failed. It's showing up as completely disconnected, and this is probably what you'll see when a drive starts to fail. At some point, it's just not going to be available, so it's going to be as if you physically removed it from the computer. That's pretty scary. Let's see if we can still access my very important file. So here's the E drive. And sure enough, so that's great. I was able to save a file into Storage Spaces and then yank a drive out and still access the file. It's all built into Windows. It's really cool. I love Storage Spaces. Now let's see if we can repair this pool. What we can do now is remove this drive from the pool. I need to go up and click Change Settings there because it requires administrative access. So because the drive isn't simply disconnected, I will need to remove it. And what that has done is restored the drive to good condition. One drive was missing, I removed it. Now it thinks everything is okay because the storage pool automatically healed itself. I don't actually have to do anything else. I had a parity selected here, and the 4 remaining drives still provide enough capacity for me to continue using parity. Now, let's say I wanted to replace that existing drive. So what I'll do is I'll shut this computer down now and add another drive in and then add it to the existing pool. All right, so I pulled out the dead drive and I found another old hard drive and stuck it there in its place. So I'll log into Windows and we'll go in and add that new drive to the pool. Once again, I'm just going to search the Start menu for Storage Spaces. Before I can do anything, I have to click the Change Settings button here and go through a user account control prompt. Now I will add the new drive to the storage pool by clicking the Add Drives link here. You can see it detects a new drive. Notice this is a 200 gigabyte drive. The previous failed drive was 25 gigabytes. So I'm just replacing it with a totally different size drive. This makes it way better than the old RAID systems that if you lost a drive, you had to replace it with an identical drive. Sometimes it would be years later and you wouldn't even be able to get the same capacity drive. It was a total pain, but with Storage Spaces and storage pools, you can just throw in basically any size drive that you want. So now with Storage Spaces, you don't have to worry about matching drive capacities or drive speeds. You throw in whatever mess of drives that you have and Windows figures out the best way to use it for you. You can see that's all there is to it now. I stuck that new drive in and it automatically added it to my storage space. And in fact, it actually increased the capacity of the pool. You can see it's already okay and being used a little bit. It's already copied some parity information over to the drive. There's nothing else for me to do. My problem is solved. I lost a drive, but didn't lose any data, and I can expand it either to replace failed drives or to add capacity. Storage Spaces is great. I highly recommend using virtual machines and adding a ton of virtual drives to it and playing with it just like we did here. Once you get a good feel for it, try it out in the real world and just connect all the drives in that you can. This is Tony Northrup for TrainSignal, and I hope you found the lesson both educational and enjoyable, and I'll see you next time.